So good afternoon, everyone. This is the channel on education, and today we're going to be looking at grammar. So grammar is a word that can scare a lot of people. People have mixed emotions. Some people love it, some people hate it. Graham, you love it?
Yeah, I love it.
I can see you really love it. So yeah, and that's for both students and teachers as well. So we're going to be joined by Graham and Beverly here in Barcelona. And then in Madrid we have Sam and Dan as well. So we'd like you guys to let us know, comments, you can leave them on the YouTube channel. My name is Rob, so let's get started. So, I'm going to come to you, Sam, first. And so I want you to define grammar. What do you mean by grammar?
Well, when we talk about grammar, we mean the structure or the system that governs a language. Basically the building blocks, the foundations through which a language grows or can exist. So basically it's the most essential structure that you need to know in order to speak a language or to know a language.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so we actually did a survey of our teachers and we asked them how much do they enjoy teaching grammar, and actually from a score from 5 there was an average of 4, so 4 being quite high. Dan, would that surprise you that people love teaching grammar so much?
Not so much. I think you can put a bit of effort into having exercises where they can do gap fills. So sometimes some students like that, some teachers like doing that because it's got something that the student can physically do. And teaching grammar is super important at the end of the day. You know, there's nothing that you don't use grammar within when you're trying to express yourself. And the best part of our classes, I think, is the self-expression of the student. So the most fun you have is when you're talking and discussing things, and that obviously involves grammar. So introducing it just means that you're going to be able to communicate with your student better.
Absolutely. I mean, we actually did another question, and we were asked about how important it is to study grammar with the students, and from a score of 10, there was lots of 10s to 10s, but a low score being 3. Someone mentioned 3. So again, Sam, does that shock you that there's such a big difference between teachers' opinions?
Well, it doesn't really shock me. And to be honest, I'm more on the 3 side than on the 10, because I mean, when it comes to grammar, it's more than teaching grammar, is how you teach it. If you are thinking that you can teach grammar through a very kind of traditional, methodological, memory-based learning approach, I don't think it's going to be very efficient, or I don't think that the student is going to be as benefited as, you know, compared to teaching them more just the logic behind the structure, the logic behind grammar. And a great example of that is phrasal verbs. Like, a lot of teachers have a hard time teaching phrasal verbs because we have this erroneous perception that they are just there and they are just the way they are because, you know. And phrasal verbs do have a logic, and if you transmit that logic to your students and you show them how it can be useful and why it makes sense, they can learn in a much more efficient and amazing way. I don't know. For me, the problem with grammar is more the way that we teach it and the approach that we have and the way that we teach it, more than grammar itself. So grammar can be very fun and very interesting for students. It's just finding the correct way to present it to them.
Absolutely, yeah. And Graham, just coming to you quickly, if you have got a topic like phrasal verbs, how can you make it a little bit more interesting? What techniques?
What techniques?
Yeah, for Graham.
I have no idea.
No,
teaching phrasal verbs? I haven't got much experience with teaching phrasal verbs, to be honest.
No, do you find the students are a bit reluctant to...
Yes,
yeah.
I do find that they find no sense in them. I feel like, as Sam said, you have to find some sort of sense in them, some logic, and teach them in that way, teach them with examples.
Yeah, for examples, I think you have to put it in context, right? There's no point just having a list.
Otherwise it doesn't make sense. No.
Exactly. So can we teach something like phrasal verbs, a very difficult thing in English, to a very beginner level, Graham?
Yeah, I think it is possible. I think just like grammar, yeah, it depends on your method of teaching.
I mean, I guess like we said, putting it in context and,
Yeah.
and just using simple ones for to
In the
start
beginning,
with.
I would say you would have to use very simple examples.
Absolutely, the most common ones that we use every day in English. Would you agree, Dan, that you can teach something like phrasal verbs for a low level?
Yeah, phrasal verbs are fun to teach, I think, because students always take the preposition at the end of the verb and try and figure them out separately. They take the meaning of the verb and then they start thinking about what the preposition means, and it just doesn't mean that. So I think the best way to put it into context is basically I usually just kind of give them a sentence and they have to figure out from that sentence, for example, what did you get up to this weekend? And I just teach it to them by asking them what they got up to this weekend. They question me and I explain it just means to do, for example. And then after that, I have them ask me questions with the phrasal verbs, for example. So that's not so much about showing a rule. I think explaining to them how it's used and then practicing, you know?
Absolutely, yeah. And so do you spend a lot of time going over the rule? I mean, obviously we teach grammar in our classes, but but we focus a lot on speaking and listening. But do you go really deep into the grammar?
I think it's really important with our activities that we have the opportunity to show them a grammar rule with an attachment. Whether you use it or not is at your discretion, I think. But some students have like an inductive way of learning and some deductive. I think if you can keep it deductive, then it's going to keep it conversational and better for the student to learn. But some students, maybe lower levels as well, with certain grammatical structures, might like to see that you've got the subject followed by, for example, in the perfect present tense, you've got have and then been living, for example, for the perfect continuous. Explaining the rule sometimes helps with students, but I think deductive, if you can keep it that way, they relate to it more in that way.
Absolutely, yeah, and I can see that Sam, you're nodding along as well. Would you agree with everything that was said?
Well, to some extent, I think that when that there are two approaches that you can have to grammar. There can be like active learning of the grammar in the case of what Dan mentioned, showing them the rule, and perhaps then they will incorporate the rule into the way that they speak English. Or there's also a passive way of learning grammar, whereas you're not focusing exactly on the rule, but just showing the function of different sentences and different words and different verbs and adverbs, etc. And they are kind of subconsciously incorporated into the language. So I guess that it just depends on each student and what kind of, learner they are. And that's a very important thing that you need to take into account as a teacher. You need to evaluate your students, see what works better for them, see if they're more of an active learner or a passive learner in terms of grammar. But I'm a big fan of passive learning, especially when it comes to phrasal verbs or more complicated aspects of grammar, verb tenses. I've seen a lot of students where you show them the rule and they get more confused because they see a lot of terminology, a lot of complicated big words, and they get a little bit scared and confused, where maybe you're trying to teach something that's relatively simple. So I guess it's just a judgment call.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with what you said there. Sure, you sometimes you do show them the grammar and it just overcomplicates things, like you just said.
I think it depends on the grammar rule as well, the grammar point that you're trying to show. Like he was just saying, I think if you introduce conditionals, for example, you can just do it purely through them just deductive learning, figuring it out. Because you can say, what would you do if? And you're just talking about hypothetical things with your students, or maybe things they regret in the past, depending on the conditional. But if you go and show them, this is the 0, first, second, and third conditional, then they don't need to know that terminology or anything like that. They just need to know how to use it.
Yeah. Do you find, Graham, that sometimes students ask quite a lot of questions regarding the grammar, that they really want to delve into it? Or?
Yes, I do have some, but mostly it's just deductive learning, to be honest.
Yeah.
Most of my students would prefer to learn how to use the form, and then after, maybe I do have some that would like to learn the rule as well, but not as much.
Yeah, I guess. And do you think it may be a Spanish thing? If we're thinking we're all teaching here in Spain, I find it quite, because they've been studying the grammar a lot at school or university or whatever, they're quite used to the system of studying from a textbook with the rule.
Yes, and I feel that's kind of boring for them, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and maybe a bit boring for the teacher as well.
Definitely for me.
To go over.
Rob, we've got a comment from Graham in relation to the conversation. Graham says, rules are there to bend and sometimes break.
That's a good comment, right? Yeah. Yeah, would you guys, Sam, do you agree with that rules are there to be broken?
What, sorry? Could you repeat?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't quite catch
Yeah,
that.
that rules, Beverly?
We have a comment in from Graham in regards to the conversation we're having, saying that rules are there to bend and sometimes break.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that languages are very organic, and we have a natural ability for them. And even though rules help and they give us structure and they give us clarity, our intuition is also an incredible tool, and we shouldn't take it for granted. And so when you're having a conversation with someone, you're transmitting meaning, even if they are not completely aware of everything that you're saying. Their brain is constantly trying to decipher that, and so through that process they also are learning. But I don't know, I guess it really comes down to each student. I mean, you realize with each student that everyone is just so completely different. Like you said before, some people are very methodological and they want to see every single rule, and other people like just want to learn on the go, just by talking and practicing and by exposing themselves to the language. But my recommendation to any teacher is just to find a balance between that. Try to find a balance between having a great conversation with someone, because that's something that's amazing in language, that you can teach it through so many angles and so many interests, passions and subjects, that if you find a passion or a subject that the student is motivated by, he's going to make an effort to express himself, and he's going to ask you how to express himself. And because he cares so much about transmitting his thoughts and his ideas, that effort and that consistency is going to make the difference.
Yeah. And rules being broken is a good point as well, because it seems like almost every grammar point, I mean, obviously there's exceptions, but there's always one where there's just, you say to the student, it's all like this apart from this. It always makes them laugh when they hear it, because they're like, yeah, classic English, it can't just be straightforward as a rule. So sometimes rules can be a bad thing to hold people back, because there are exceptions with most of them.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's lots of exceptions there. Well, we got to make it a bit difficult for the students, right? Give them a bit of a challenge learning English, I guess. And Dan, I know you're obviously involved in TEFL training as well, so you help people to become teachers. So what do you do to help them prepare for a lesson? Sort of what are the key components that you need to see in a lesson plan, for example?
For grammar specifically, it's always, I find it quite not stressful, but I think it's really important to do the grammar week first within the course, which is the way it's set out. And sometimes I have students who haven't done the grammar course and they join in on the second week and do that at the end. When it comes to teaching grammar, I think you do need, it's a continuous process of learning. I still find better ways of teaching grammar myself to this day. You find rules that you didn't know existed. You find ways to explain things without having to use so much attachments. You can use conversation. So I always just tell them to just, if they try and teach grammar in one way, it's good. I tell them next time you do that, maybe try and teach that same grammar rule a different way. Try approaching it in different ways,
see what works,
methodologies and stuff, and see what works for you and see what works for the students again. Because like Sam was saying, students learn in different ways. They're all really different. They're all different.
Yeah, I mean, being involved in the TEFL myself, sometimes I find that the TEFLs, they worry more about teaching the grammar than, say, a conversational activity or some vocabulary. They tend to worry more about the structures. But like you say, with practice and new techniques and learning what works, then you pick it up quite quickly, I guess.
Yeah.
Beverly, do we have any more comments or questions?
Yeah, we've got a question from Alexis. How do you prefer to correct grammar mistakes during a grammar lesson or conversation?
Well, for myself, if I speak for myself, I'll do on-the-spot correction, especially when it's grammar, because you're practicing a specific tense, for example, then you need to be on the ball correcting exactly in the moment as it's happening. I don't know, Sam, would you agree?
Yes, I think that, well, as always, it depends on the student, but in most cases, correcting it on the spot is very helpful, and they usually always correct it immediately and keep going. And then you can even see at the end of the class how a lot of times they even incorporated the correction you gave them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, with my correction, I always try and get the student to correct themselves if it's grammar. A really common one I see with like maybe P3s and stuff is people is crazy, for example.
Yeah.
Instead of saying people are crazy, I say people. I repeat what they've said to them and say people is, and they're like questioning me, like, yeah, people is, and then they say people are, and then they don't make that mistake again, or if they do, they correct themselves before you've got a chance to question it. I think.
Yeah, that's a good example, a typical example, right? It's and then people and persons always comes up as well. That's and as you say, just repeating it, they can kind of correct themselves.
Yeah. So I do the same as you. I do like the immediate correction, but at the same time, I let them finish this phrase they're saying, and then I say that was good, but. And then repeat their mistake to them and get them to correct it themselves.
Yeah, and that all comes down to whether self-correction, peer correction, they can correct each other within the group.
Yeah, sometimes you get if they can't correct themselves, I might say to someone else in the class, can you help them out? I don't want to have to correct if they can correct between themselves.
Yeah, very well. Beverly, yeah?
We've got another comment in from Graham. Many native speakers I know use grammar incorrectly. I can't expect a student to be totally perfect.
Yeah, I think we're going to come to that in a bit, actually. That was a question I had about, obviously we're all from different parts of the world, Britain, South Africa, America, the States, wherever. We all make mistakes. We've all got our little unique expressions or accents. How correct should we be speaking? I mean, is it okay sometimes not to? I'll give you an example. When I'm with my friends, I tend to say use. Right, with an S for the plural. Could or should I do that in class, Dan?
No. I don't think so. You can do it with your friends if you can do it with the high-level students, for sure. But don't start using it with someone who's picking it up at like a P3 level or P2 level, because they're going to think it's correct. They're going to think they're looking to you as a native, like, this guy speaks perfect English, and you do. I'm not saying you don't, but like. We've all got things that we say which we know are stupid or incorrect, but we say them for humor, and you can incorporate that into lessons with other students and explain, when I'm with my friends, I say this and say this to some other guys. They might find it really funny. They might even use it as a bit of humor in the class, but I don't think you should teach it that way.
No.
Well, if I can say something too, yes, I agree with Dan, because give our students, I guess, what is most useful to them, and try to give them an English that will be useful in both the UK, the States, South Africa, Australia, Europe in general. So the more broad their English, I guess, the more useful it will be. But I don't think that when you say use, for example, is incorrect. I mean, there is no authority on the English language, or at least unique authority, like say in Spain, the Royal Academy. So English is more a language that's always changing, and there's always slang being incorporated to it. So I think that we should teach it to some extent, but let them know that it is slang, that it is English, that is relevant to a specific part of the world, and that it's not going to be understood everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you made a good point about it being for high levels only. I wouldn't do it for any low level students. But I mean, I guess maybe if they're going to be traveling to the UK or the States, wherever, they're going to be hearing this type of language. So maybe to some extent it is. I have had a class actually, a high level class, and they asked me to speak to them as if I was speaking to my friends. Because
some people want it, some people want to have that proper accent that you have and hear it. And you see people who go and live abroad in the UK, for example, in the north, they come back with a northern accent. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah.
Accent after learning it as a second language. So it's never a bad thing. But I think when it's teaching, you need to be careful of what you're actually teaching. So they need to know what's right, well, not what's right, what's wrong, but where they're going to be understood when they.
Absolutely, yeah. Grim, can you think off the top of your head, is there any little thing
South
like
African
the use, that you would say?
I would say the problem with South African, English, is that we use a lot of languages, like we have a lot of influence from other languages. So, like when we speak English, I might say something like, oh yeah, that's really cool, that's lekker.
Lekker.
Lekker's from Dutch. So if I taught my students that, it probably wouldn't be a good idea, but it is something in South Africa we use all the time.
And what does it mean, lekker?
It's great.
It's good.
Cool. Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
Nice.
So we have a lot of things like that I would refrain from teaching my students.
Yeah. Yeah. Beverly, anything else?
I think probably the most common thing that I say, and I realise once I've said it that perhaps I shouldn't have said it, is, do you know what I mean?
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, because it's quite a London thing. Do you know what I mean?
You know what I mean? Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so let's have a little brainstorm together as a group about how we can, going back to the grammar, how we can introduce a grammar activity in a fun, engaging way, so we don't put the students off. What techniques can we use? Any ideas, you guys in Madrid?
Well, even the way that we start each class, in a way, it's a structure activity. It's a grammar activity. When we do pick questions with our students, we are essentially teaching them grammar in a very straightforward way, but it's just through conversation. I think that everything is presentation. You pull out, I don't know, a Microsoft PowerPoint presentation or something that is very traditional and relatively boring, the student's gonna probably reject it.
Yeah.
But if you're just conversing and through quick questions, through fun text, through, I don't know, role plays, imagining different situations, you can just get them to start interacting and start experimenting with their sentences. And when they are experimenting and trying to express themselves, correct them on the spot, and they keep getting better, and they start to flow more naturally and fluidly.
Yeah. Things like WH questions is involved in like grammar exercise, and it's just a back and forth. You can ask each other questions. You can have a big group, small group. You can get into it with a student. All the tenses, you can start talking about their experiences in the past or their plans for the future, or how long they've been here, for example. I mean, there's loads of different relatable things within their lives that I think you can try and do. And then obviously we've got the topics, which makes for a bit more conversation, and within that, just through the conversation, you're always correcting grammar or using grammar. You never speak without using
I think once you know the students well, you can kind of refer back to their hobbies, their interests, and then make the grammar about that, and it makes it a little bit easier, and maybe not easier but more fun to both teach.
I think that's the most important part.
It's just finding that thing. Beverly, do you have more questions?
Yeah, we've got a question in from Graham about technique, teaching technique. So his question is it more important to know grammar off by heart or know the best techniques to teach it?
It's a difficult question. I find
put us on the spot there.
I find teaching grammar gets easier, and it's definitely gotten easier for me, and I do know it better in my head because of teaching the TEFL. But obviously when there's other people who are just teaching students, I think you get the same amount of practice and find your own different ways of teaching it. I think it is important to know. Also, if you ever have to make any correction and you don't have the grammar rule within the activities that you're making the correction on that grammar point, I think it's really important to be able to say, if you need to, this is where you're going wrong, or even if you want to and they want to see the rule, you can explain it off the top of your head. So I think it's important to have the knowledge in your head, but I also think that you've got to appreciate that it takes time. It's not, you don't become a teacher and just know all of this grammar. You have to continuously teach it, find different ways, and you do start to just remember all of it.
With practice and experience, you learn the techniques, right? I don't know, Graham, you've been teaching for a year or so now, I think. So have you found certain ways, techniques to teach the third conditional or phrasal verbs or whatever?
It has gotten easier, but I still find a lot of difficulty with it. I feel like I've definitely learned grammar a lot better since I started, I don't know, 8 months ago. But the techniques I would say are really important. I still don't know exactly. I don't know my grammar perfectly, but I would say it's improved a lot since.
It's just, and with preparation as well, and you being prepared for the classes, you're ready for any questions that the students may have, because they can just put you on the spot with a random question, and it's just about being prepared for that. So Beverly, any more comments or questions?
Well, Graham's followed up to his question with the 3 Ps. Present, practice, produce.
Perfect.
Which I think sums up
is the way we do
a great technique.
We do it for all our classes, right? Anything else?
We have a question in from Catherine relating to our conversation about slang terms. Do you think it helps to explain the use of slang if you accidentally use slang in a lesson?
if it helps to
explain the use of slang if you accidentally use slang in a lesson.
I mean, slang exists in all language, right? So you've got Spanish slang, you've got French slang. Every language has slang, so I don't think you need to kind of explain too much about what it is. But maybe the definition, yeah. If I use some slang in class, maybe I would explain to the students, oh, well, this is typical from wherever, and I use it when I'm in a social situation, for example. Any other comments?
Yeah, slang's fun.
Yeah, I think students really enjoy it as well.
Yeah.
It's...
I introduce some slang words, even if I'm just following my lesson plan of the activities I've got. If we're talking and they bring up something where I could use some slang that I might use in my hometown, I don't see why I couldn't introduce that to them. And sometimes it's quite funny.
Yeah.
Sometimes if it's the right student, it can be a bit rude, but they find it funny within that class. You know, it depends on the students again.
Yeah.
But slang, I think, is important. You know, it's really important because you won't understand if you go somewhere where they use a lot of slang. You're going to be a lot of things you don't understand.
Yeah.
I have a question.
If you want
you have
to,
a question?
have fun.
Yeah, right, for everyone else. So, has anyone got any students that they might have been teaching for quite a while, and maybe they're a lower level student, and for allowing the student to understand them, they might lower their level of their grammar or their language? Does anyone find that ever?
So you mean grading our language?
Grading language, but sometimes using it wrong and not being able to get out of it, or maybe sometimes struggling to explain the correct way once you've used the grading quite lowly.
Yeah, so you mean maybe not like putting the verb into the past and using the present and this type of thing, maybe, maybe sometimes if I find the students struggling a little bit, I try not to do it, and if I do it, I would give the correct, and then if they didn't understand, then maybe use the present tense, for example, because I presume we are thinking about low levels. Sam, have you had some difficulty maybe conversing with a student, and you've had to maybe use some incorrect English to get your point across?
Not really. I haven't had to use, fortunately, incorrect English. I have had to rephrase question, comments into let's say, the simplest, most efficient expression, because I mean, sometimes the student just has a hard time understanding it, but
I think.
But fortunately, I've never had to at least break my English or just change it. Something that I always tell my students, especially related to grammar, is to stop constantly comparing it to their mother tongue, because each structure of grammatical structure of every language is different, and so I find a lot of the times students are trying to impose, say, Spanish grammar into English, and the most common example is putting the adjective before a noun. A lot of students will say the noun and the adjective after, because they're just extrapolating their Spanish grammar into English. So what I always tell them is just put that apart, and let's see this from the very beginning. Let's try to understand from the bottom up, because sometimes, even though there are a lot of cognates in Spanish and we do share some rules, it's not as useful as we might think, and there's a lot of transliteration more than translation.
Yeah, when I try and explain some words to students, though is an example I came across, try and explain though to a student, especially if it's a low level. They're just looking at you and they're just telling you Spanish words, and they're like, is it this, this, and this? And you're like, well, it is, and it isn't, and it is, and it isn't. And I just say to them, stop trying to find a Spanish word for it.
We've got to get them trying to think in English as soon as possible, as early as possible. And going back to the original question, I think that if you use your body, like your language as well, so if you're pointing in the past, like behind you for the past or forwards for the future, this type of thing, they understand that you're using the verb in the past, for example. Yeah,
so I'm the same as Sam. I don't think I ever really use any incorrect English in my class. If they don't understand the verb that just say it's a sentence and I use an irregular verb in the past or something, I might say to them, I'll repeat it slower, grade my language, and then I might say the verb on its own and be like, you know what this verb is? it's in the past, and then repeat the question again or the sentence again, you know, like that.
Absolutely, yeah. Perfect. So I don't know if we have any more comments, Beverly, or...
We've got a question from Monica in relation to corrections. What do you do when the student repeats the same mistake over and over again? Do you keep correcting them when they do it?
Yes.
Yeah. we all said yes at the same time. Yeah. In answer to your question, Monica, yes, I would always suggest correcting. You don't kind of let it go, because how are they going to learn if they've already in this habit of making that mistake? If you don't correct them, they're going to continue to make that mistake. And so I think it's important.
And if you keep correcting, and you have to correct all throughout the class, even if at the end of the class they get that sentence right, then they've learned.
Then your job is done, right? They've learned something, and they can take something away. And maybe you could, I don't know, suggest fining them every time they say it wrong. A euro fine, maybe, or something, every time you say it wrong. Maybe would help them learn. Anything else?
We've got a final question. Should we use grammar terms with students? Is it important, or does it confuse them? Do they need to know what it is called? For example, this is the present perfect, future continuous, etc. Or do they only need to know what it does and how it works?
Sam, I think maybe, did you mention something a little bit similar at the start about...
Well, I think that it depends on the level. If they're a low level, I don't think that your priority at the moment is for them to know every single term, like present continuous or past, perfect, things like that. But once they start getting to the level where they feel comfortable with these terms, why not? Present it to them, give it to them, teach them. But I mean, I don't think that it's absolutely essential for them to learn every single term in order for them to have good English or to be able to communicate efficiently. But you can, of course, give them as much knowledge and information on the language as you can. Some students are gonna reject it because for some reason the people who gave the names to these terms just gave very unattractive names to them.
Difficult ones to remember. And sometimes I have had students, when we've been practicing something like the future perfect, for example, we've got plenty of practice, and they would say, oh, what's the name of this tense or something, so just for them to help them remember. So I think we're wrapping up now. So if you guys at home need any help planning your lessons, or any help from, regarding grammar, then you can get in touch with us at oxinity.com. Thank you to you guys in Madrid, and thank you to you too here in Barcelona, and I hope you have a nice afternoon.
You too.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.